states with key principles such as individual freedoms, social and racial justice, human dignity, rights, solidarity, gender equality, and environmental concerns. Influential scholars, such as Nancy Fraser, have recently identified most of these spheres as critical concerns for contemporary political thought. However, it seems to me that a more comprehensive political elaboration is needed to provide a theoretical frame to fit these as well as other concerns of political, social, economic, ethical, and cultural nature. However, it appears today that to achieve significant understanding of such realities, several dimensions of philosophical activity will prove to be particularly relevant as a general style of approach of philosophy. First, we do expect philosophy to develop historically informed critiques of the cultural and conceptual frames that are deeply embedded in contemporary political, ethical discourses. For lack of this historical dimension, an informed assessment of cultural transformations and of political dynamics becomes problematic, or at least very limited. Second, as philosophers, we are no longer entitled to conceive our work as exclusively focused on our own discipline. For philosophy to remain culturally relevant, there is a growing need for us to dismantle the disciplinary barriers that have secluded our fields of investigation from our disciplines in the humanities, from the arts, from other methods of social analysis, other forms of science, and other spiritual traditions. Too often philosophers only read philosophy, and too often philosophical works, even when they're very good academically, too often they are exclusively read by philosophers. This was not the original idea of philosophy as a fully scholar, yet publicly engaged activity. Not necessarily through immediate political action, but certainly as an intellectual commitment inspirited by a long-term vision of the models we would like our cultures and societies to be inspired by. Third, and most fundamental perhaps, we believe that to be able to make sense of the cultural, social, and political complexity of our world, philosophy, and Western philosophy in particular, needs to take a durable cross-cultural turn. Philosophy, as we mostly know it, no longer suffices to make sense of cultural dynamics that have become too entangled to be deciphered and understood from within a single cultural horizon. A more inclusive set of philosophical concepts is required to unravel the complex logics of our time, to understand their historical roots, and to effectively address them. In my view, therefore, it is time for our scholarly communities to acknowledge cross-cultural inclusiveness as an irreversible orientation in contemporary philosophy, to give proper value and recognition to the philosophical heritage and methods of a plurality of human civilizations, to reassess the philosophical motives and contents of the so-called oral and spiritual traditions that the Western canon has often relegated to a lower rank than philosophy, and to incorporate these different traditions within our standard and daily academic assignments. Let me be very clear in this regard. I'm not arguing in favor of a diluted, all-embracing version of philosophy that would give up its disciplinary uniqueness. This is not what we want, not at all. Boundaries are critical intellectual tools that frame our understanding of the world and shape it. But we may expect for these boundaries to be conceived as functional tools, none of which is beyond the possibility of being dismantled, rather than as rigid divides. If we look at the history of our discipline, we notice that the scope of philosophy itself is anything but rigid. And this is why expanding the canon and the scope of philosophy requires a careful and very exciting reappraisal of the relations between philosophy and other forms of science, of spirituality, even of religion. This reappraisal will not leave the contents of philosophical thought unaffected. Consider, for instance, the inextricable relationship between philosophy and religion in many traditions of thought, including the Western one. Professor McBride just mentioned St. Augustine. Consider what tremendous philosophical insights many non-Western traditions have provided on causality, subjectivity, and on the eschatological dimension of human life, which forms the ground of moral feeling. Consider the incalculable developments that philosophical analysis, analytical philosophy, may draw from addressing non-Western linguistic systems, including non-alphabetic ones, as many analytical philosophers are already doing. Philosophy Facing World Problems, the title of this conference, implies, therefore, a very deep understanding of philosophy as a powerful conceptual tool to understand human and social interaction. Learning to see through our neighbors' eyes, becoming increasingly cognizant of their sensitivities, or at least doing our best to expand our understanding of the world. These are, in my view, useful tools for transcending boundaries and for learning to be decent human beings. And recalling the themes of the two last World Congresses, learning to be human and philosophy across boundaries. In the words of our late friend and colleague, Thai Muslim professor Chaiwat Satanan, who very recently passed away, one of the tools philosophy has to confront the danger of a globalization of indifference is precisely our capacity to make ourselves vulnerable to external inputs, to external influence, vulnerable to external experience, a capacity which, incidentally, happens to be the moral ground of a culture of peace. To view philosophy as an education towards mutual vulnerability seems to me neither delusional nor naively utopian, today more than ever. On the contrary, this deeply human and at the same time permanent cultural dimension is the core drive of the historical relevance of philosophy throughout its entire development, and possibly a very powerful antidote to a culture of violence and prevarication. Let me emphasize once again the connecting function that scholars are likely to play in a multipolar world. Not only a theoretical approach, but also a practical role, I would say a historical role, that consists of bridging intellectual communities across political and cultural boundaries. This, precisely for what it is, this is not a time to exclude, to divide, or to sever intellectual and academic bonds. Nor is this a time to distance or isolate ourselves from our colleagues. It is rather a time when we, as scholars and particularly as philosophers, are called on to assume a historical function, the function of securing permanent scholarly exchanges across political boundaries, of turning our philosophical reflections in ways that would make these global connections possible and foster them and facilitate them, of building wide-ranging academic networks, and essentially of making sure that cultural systems, academic communities, and human civilizations at large remain mutually permeable. Philosophy and the humanities and scholarship at large must remain an open tribune for scholars from all areas of the world, all faiths, all genders, religions, languages, and nationalities. Today more than ever, this combination of open humanistic education and technical knowledge, along with a widely cross-cultural view of human societies, is critical to ensure full freedom of choice, full citizenship, and prosperity to the younger generations. Among the world crises we are going through, there is undoubtedly a crisis of democratic order, not in the exclusive sense of political regimes, but as an inclusive social order that ensures equal participation to all members of a community and to all human communities at large. Here is one of the critical roles of philosophy today. Philosophy can and probably should educate to citizenship as a way to feel at home in a larger world than one's own home. Or if you prefer, philosophy shall educate to consider the world as one's home. I remember the sentence of an old friend of FISP, Professor Insuk Cha, who used the expression mondialization of home. Thank you, Professor Kuchuradi. Thank you for having considerably advanced in this direction, and thank you for having inspired many of us to follow on your own steps. And thank you all, and congratulations for this 50th anniversary. Thank you.
Now, I think Professor Dr. Klaus Leisinger will give us a lecture on corporate responsibility in difficult times.
Thank you very much. Please,
Bitte schön.
technology.
Daha önce verilmiş slaytlar. Efendim? Sunum için slaytlar gerekli. Acaba kim bu işlerle ilgileniyor? Tamam mıdır efendim? Efendim?
Buradan bağlantı bakacağım yukarıda çünkü biraz önce yansıyordu. Tekrardan bir şey yapayım. Biraz önce yansıyordu, sıkıntı yoktu.
Next time I will not work with slides, so we save time. Anyway, let me start and say corporate responsibility. I do have a technology problem. Today is a very special day. Never before in human history were so many people living on this earth. It's more than 8,100,000,000 today, and the world population continues to grow about 200,000 people per day. And at the end of this day, there will be 60,000 more Earth inhabitants than were this morning. And the result of what has been done in the economic and the social and the medical and the engineering sides has led to a situation where all over the world, the human quality of life is better than it was in the past. We have lower child mortality, we have lower infant mortality, we have higher incomes, we have more research, better connectivity, better cooperation. And the price that had to be paid for that was a high price because we were living above our ecological budgets. We have a tremendous deterioration of biological diversity. We are using non-renewable resources in a speed and to an extent that no generation before us has done so. And the problem is that at the moment, while I'm just coming back from New York on the General Assembly and for discussion on this pact on the future, everybody is discussing the ecological dimension of sustainability, and we seem to have forgotten there is a social dimension. We have a justice problem, we have a fairness problem, the sentence that we will leave no one behind and that we will try, whatever we do, that it serves the least is simply cynical. The opposite is happening. And a first thing for a sober analysis is being honest to each other. What are the facts? What exactly is the problem and where? The problem at the moment is that we have cumulative change and circular interdependence, meaning if you have a war in the Ukraine, it matters immediately for the food security in a lot of West African and East African cities. If you have higher energy prices, it's not only that the prices go up and driving and flying becomes more expensive, but that you also have a totally different mindset with regard to what can be done. And if you add on that increasing migration, increasing public debts, decreasing political stability, we are in a real mess. And it was Einstein who once said, we cannot solve a problem with the same mindset that created it. And Einstein said it is insanity doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I'm expecting different results for my call with regard to technology. It seems to be insanity. There has been, in September 2015, a huge progress with regard to political and social and economic debates. It was the resolution adopted by the General Assembly transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the preamble of this agenda says it's a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. And all countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. Now, another result of this discussion were 17 goals: no poverty, no hunger, good health, and so on, but also climate action. And, as you know, and I was glad that, oh, look at that. Shall I start again? No, that was a joke. Anyway, what Professor Kuchurati said this morning, that it is so important that we make clear what we mean when we use certain terms, is exactly the same here. If you talk to a North American business person, they will have a different definition than if you talk to a farmer in East Africa. The point is here, I've worked with the UN for more than 20 years. One of the tricks of the United Nations, by the way, also of the European community, if you want consensus, you go higher and higher and higher in abstraction levels. You go to a level where everybody can agree, motherhood and apple pie. Who can be against that? So what exactly do we mean if we say sustainable, consumption and sustainable production, and at the same time say climate action, and at the same time say no poverty. The results of the analysis in July was only 17% of the Sustainable Development Targets are on track. Nearly half are showing minimal or moderate progress. Escalating conflicts, geopolitical tensions, and growing climate chaos are hitting SDGs progress hard. Systemic deficiencies and inequalities of the global economic and social system leave developing countries to tackle enormous and growing challenge. Just to give you one little piece of evidence, if Germany goes to the International Monetary Fund and wants a credit, they pay 2.9%. If Nigeria goes to the IMF and wants a credit, they pay 24%. And if Germany goes and wants it for 20 years, they get it. And if Nigeria wants it, they get it for 3 to 5 years. And everybody knows that you can't repay a credit with such a high interest in 2 to 3 years. So just talking about honesty. The point here that I want to make, and then I come to the actual subject, what is a fair societal division of responsibility? Who is accountable for what? If you live in a village, you know, if you have a problem and you go to the priest, you get a different answer than if you go to the policeman or to the mayor or to the shopkeeper or to the kindergarten teacher. It's the same in a national society. You know, who exactly is responsible for what? And if you look at the global level, it's exactly the same. For example, we know that G7 has done an overproportional impact on the climate issue that we have at the moment. And that those who suffer most of climate change, for example, the islands in the South Pacific or the farmers in East Africa, have contributed least to climate change. So what would be a fair approach? I mean, if you ask a child, it will tell you that those, the polluter pays principle, by the way, that those who have contributed more to a problem are more accountable for solutions. I'm not so sure whether this is understood. Who exactly is responsible for what and why? My impression last week in New York was industry or the private sector is by most political delegates and, by the way, by most of the philosophers I know, not Johanna Gujarati, industry, the private sector is perceived to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. And at the same time, if you ask, you know, what exactly, whose actors are doing what with regard to innovation, with regard to changing the things we do technically, not socially, not societally, you know, you will have to bring in the private sector and create win-win situations. You have to give incentives rather than moralizing and condemning. The role of the business in society has changed tremendously. Most, at least in Germany, most business ethicists in Switzerland, most business ethicists that I know always quote old Friedman in 1962, the one and only social responsibility of business is to use its resources, engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. That was the old one, the old responsibility definition. You provide goods, you make profit, you adhere to law, or at least do not get caught. You provide job, and you pay taxes, hopefully as little as possible. Now, I do not want to justify Friedman, but what one could say is, as long as it stays with the rules of the game, the rules have changed. So business has to change because the rules of the games of the 60s are totally different from the rules of the games of the 90s, of the 20s, and today of the 2020s. Leadership for sustainable development is, first of all, acknowledge that sustainable development is not compatible with business as usual. You would expect that business leaders go through the 17 goals and the 166 targets and say, you know, what does that mean for our company? What does that mean for our business concept? What does it mean for the business model? Think of the oil industry. And then what can we do? And by the way, not only theoretically, what can we do, but then make a plan, make a budget, and be counted in the sense of publish what you want to do. And every year when you publish again, show what progress have you made, or show the obstacles that you met. Reflect on what this means. Assess the strengths, the opportunities, the weaknesses, and the threats of your business. When you talk during the Global Compact meetings last week in New York, every company has one or two positive case studies, and they pull that out and say, look, this is, yeah. Most often that's the exception to the rule and not the rule, but at least it's a progress that can be shown. Define strategies, policies, and smart goals. Smart goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Not we want to, but we will, until then, particularly with regard to that, do this. And then you can be made accountable. Amend targets. What are people doing? Well, one of the biggest problems, not only for business, but also for politics, is with regard to sustainable development. If you want to be re-elected in 4 years, will you burden your constituency with things changing the ecological footprint, that the gasoline becomes more expensive, individual traffic should not be encouraged, and so on? With regard to business, you know, as long as a company that is at a public place, you have to report every year. And the financial market obviously expects growing profits every year. And most of the top management have 30-40% fixed salary and 60% flexible salary bound on the profit and the turnover. What do you expect are these people doing? And only if you amend target setting, job descriptions, performance appraisals, bonus system, and the selection as well as promotion criteria of people with softer things than financial indicators, will you have a better chance that they are achieved. Communicate on results achieved and obstacles met. The last 7 years I worked for Novartis, I lost the battle every year when I was proposing, let's in our annual report not only show what we have done, but also show the problems not saved, the dilemmas to be shared, so that people know we know there are problems we have not yet solved. And by the way, there are dilemmas. It's not bad or cold-blooded or antisocial. It is a balance of arguments, and that balance in the private sector might be a different one than, let's say, with the church.